a couple of testimonies from church history. The two men pictured below are young Joseph Smith III, the son of Joseph Smith Jr., who translated the Book of Mormon, and then on the right is Israel A. Smith, a grandson of Joseph Smith Jr., the prophet. Both men served as prophet and president of the RLDS church. Joseph III was only 12 years old when his father and his uncle Hiram were assassinated in Carthage, Illinois. Shortly after that, his uncle Samuel also died. The family was shaken to its core. The church fragmented. A largest part went west with Brigham Young. The Smith family, led by Emma Smith, Joseph's widow, did not go west. They didn't go north with James Strang to Wisconsin or Michigan. They didn't go east to Pennsylvania following Sidney Rigdon. They didn't go south following Lyman White to Texas. In fact, they stayed right there in Nauvoo, which eventually had another wave of immigrants come in that were not believers in the Book of Mormon. Young Joseph grew up in that environment where he was a minority as far as religious matters go. He grew up with a stepfather that was not a member of the faith either. So this was where he grew up until he was 27 years old, when spiritual experiences indicated to him that he should take leadership of something called the New Organization. With his mother, they went to a conference, and he assumed leadership of the body that eventually would become the RLDS Church. On the right, that's Israel A., like I said. Israel A. Smith was a lawyer. He also had served the church as a member of the presiding bishopric, and eventually he too became prophet and president of the church. In his younger years, he served as a secretary and scribe for his father, Joseph III, in his late years. Much of what we know about Joseph III came from the biography that he wrote with the assistance of Israel A. In 1951, the church held a conference on the Book of Mormon. Israel A. presented a paper on the language of the Book of Mormon. This paper was later transcribed and appeared in the May 7th, 1951 issue of the Saints Herald. Following now will be a reading of two testimonies that came out of that article.
When I was much younger, without admitting my age, however, was a member of the Iowa legislature. There I became acquainted with many men who became prominent in the affairs of that state. A number of them later served as governors of Iowa. One of them was William L. Harding. Some years after I removed to Missouri, I happened to be in Detroit when Governor Harding was there, and I had a very pleasant visit with him. It was well known when I was sitting in the legislature that I was a member of the Reorganized church, and my church background was respected. As a matter of fact, I was given a prominent committee chairmanship because of the excellent reputation of our church people, not because of any request made by me or by them, but because the Anti-Saloon League, the WCTU, and the Prohibition Amendment League made specific requests to the Speaker of the House. But while my connection with the church was known to all, very few of my colleagues ever talked with me about it. This day at Detroit, however, after we had canvassed many things and recalled mutual experiences, Governor Harding very abruptly asked me a question. He wanted to know if I believed my grandfather had participated in a conspiracy with others to impose upon the public a spurious record in the Book of Mormon. The question, coming so unexpectedly, quite staggered me. I did not flatter myself that I was fully prepared to meet a situation like that. But through the years since then, as I have recalled the experience, I believe there was a degree of inspiration in the way I met it. It bashed through my thinking. Here is a very astute lawyer. I knew of his reputation as an attorney. I knew he had been especially successful in criminal cases. Here is a man, I thought, who understands human nature, or he would not be so successful with juries. So I said to him, Governor, do you believe that some 8 or 11 or more men could go into a conspiracy such as you suggest and give their testimony with respect to the Book of Mormon, a false document, and put over anything of that kind without some one or more, or perhaps all of them at some time during their lives, acknowledging they had perjured themselves or borne false testimony? And then I followed about like this. Governor Harding, history records it to be a fact, and I accept it as a fact, that my grandfather had very little in the way of scholastic advantages. In other words, he was an unschooled youth. But I believe he was an intelligent, studious man, and I believe that those who are at all familiar with his life's history will have to admit that before his death he was fairly well educated according to the standards of his day, and even according to the standards of the present time. But, I added, at no time during his life was he smart enough to write the Book of Mormon. The governor responded very satisfactorily, that is a pretty fair answer. Then he expressed a desire to read the book. I gave him one, by chance happening to have a new copy with me. I saw him frequently after that, up to the time of his death some 14 years ago, but we never discussed the matter again, though perhaps I should have asked him about it, and I do not know whether he read the book.
In this same Saints Herald article, Israel A. offers up the testimony of his father, who apparently had some reticence concerning the Book of Mormon, and while sharing a sermon, had the following experience.
I do not blame anybody for having reservations about the Book of Mormon, especially those who are investigating, because of the marvelous and miraculous way in which it allegedly has come about. My own father, early in his ministry, had some hesitation about it. There are those here who knew him, who probably have a pretty good idea as to his character. I think that of all the men I have known, and I had pretty close contact with him for a number of years as his secretary, in my time, in whose integrity I had absolute confidence, he would take undoubtedly the top place with all of them. He said that he had reservations about the Book of Mormon for some years after he took the presidency of the church. But one day, when he was occupying the pulpit, he mentioned the Book of Mormon. As he did, an audible voice spoke to him, as if coming from a person at his right, saying, "The Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity." He related that he stood still and listened. A second time the statement was repeated, and still he stood there. And the third time the voice said, "The Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity." He said he never had any difficulty in talking about the Book of Mormon after that. Paul says that to some it is given to know. To them knowledge is given, just as many of you have received a testimony about the truthfulness of this book, and to others it is given to believe on their testimony. And it is even more blessed for the latter to exercise faith and believe than it is for those to whom the testimony was directly given. It 1 second disastrous for one to have a testimony and then repudiate it. I declare that if I did not have any testimony about this Book of Mormon myself, I could believe on the testimony of my father. I believe there are others here who could almost say the same thing. Now I believe that of all the people in the world, we have the least excuse for finding lodgment in our hearts and minds for this spirit of secularism. I think we have a story of adventure such as no other church in the world has. And I don't see any reason why we should lose interest and faint and fall by the wayside, adopting the words of Henry Van Dyke. So let the way wind up the hill or down, or rough or smooth, there will be joy. Stilt seeking what I when but a boy. New friendships high in a crown. My heart will keep the courage of the quest.
Not today, but I hope sometime soon I'll sit around and read out of an older, much older Saints Herald, where young Joseph III, interviewed his mother in her last days on earth. She explained her perception of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, how her husband didn't have the education to write it, how those plates sat on her dining table covered in cloth and she could feel the rustling of the plates, how she acted as scribe. She had a first-hand knowledge in those days, and we have been very blessed that Joseph III took the time to interview his mother for the benefit of those of us who would come after. I hope today that you've enjoyed hearing the testimony of Joseph III and also of the understanding of Israel A, of how human beings operate and how unlikely from a legal standpoint it was that 11 people would not be able to get together and pull something off like this. Look forward to seeing you again sometime. May God bless. Bye-bye.